So, a fun fact about the UK. In the early 2000s, we actually had two separate official PlayStation magazines, one covering the then new PS2, and another covering the aging PS1. While the original magazine spent a lot of time hyping up the PS2 in the run-up to its launch, the decision was made to create a separate publication once the console actually hit. It makes sense looking back. OPM was the best-selling video game magazine in the world in 1999. Come the year 2000, the PS2 was being hit with delays in the UK, while the PS1 was still on top of the world, with a cute new redesign and major releases like Final Fantasy IX, Dance Dance Revolution and The Weakest Link, all still on the horizon. Both magazines came bundled with demo discs each month, and their already high cover price would have skyrocketed if they had to ship out with separate discs for each system, so separate mags it was. We weren't the only country to do this, the same thing happened in Australia and New Zealand, it just made sense. The real shocker here is that the PS1 magazine managed to keep running until the March of 2004. And I must stress, once again, that this was the official magazine, as in Sony licensed, as in Future Publishing paid Sony to keep this branding until the year that Half-Life 2 came out, the year before the Xbox 360 was released. The PS2 generation was almost over before the PS1 magazine finally died. The mag did feature bits and pieces of next-gen coverage, but most of its pages were dedicated to the older console, and by the end, the PS2 was relegated to a couple of reviews in the back. As the 2000s progressed and it became clear that the PS2 was going to outsell even its record-breaking predecessor, there would be fewer and fewer publishers releasing new games for the humble grey box. But OPM held fast and kept pumping out new issues even as the release schedule dried up to basically nothing. The mag was just too popular to be cancelled. But what the hell was there left to cover? There was the odd PSP feature, sure, but the PS2 mag was all over that. And by the end, all that was coming out for the PS1 was low-budget grandma traps and ports of retro games. Would the cover disc, now full of demos and trailers for years-old games, really be enough to keep readers coming when several of the console's classics could be bought for less than the mag's cover price? The staff had to get creative, maybe even a little silly, to make a magazine that was still worth buying. Themed issues became commonplace, the regular features got wackier and wackier, and the port begging got more desperate. The end result is something that feels less like an official magazine, and more like a fanzine, the center of a small community of enthusiast weirdos who refuse to let their favorite corporate toy die. It was great though. Not all of the humor has aged especially well, and some of their opinions are, well, wrong, but I looked forward to getting it each month. I loved the quirky humor, I loved the net Eurosi games, I loved the larger-than-life personas of the writing staff, and I loved the absolute ubiquity of Final Fantasy within its pages. When I said the mag felt like a fanzine, this is what I meant. It owned. FF7 was the first story I can ever remember taking seriously, my child brain working overtime thinking about its themes and what it all means. And Final Fantasy VIII changed my personality for the worse. I genuinely thought Squall was super cool and used to imitate him heading into secondary school. It's embarrassing to think about now, but who wasn't a little embarrassing at that age? I wonder if all my whatevers are still floating around in some AOL forum archive somewhere. Back in the 90s, it was always up in the air whether a given Square game would even release over here in Euroland. But because I'm British and stealing from other countries is foundational to our culture, I grew up with a chipped PS1. So in 1999, when Final Fantasy Anthology released in the America, there was actually nothing stopping me from playing it. If only I knew it existed. By the time I was made aware of it, and then Chronicles in 2001, our original chipped PS1 had sadly passed away. The new PS1 was legit only. My mum was convinced that the last one had died because of the mod chip, so no more imports for me. Anthology wouldn't release over here until 2002, and it's not like I could just buy the SNES versions. Before the PS1 came along, we were a Sega household, and only Mystic Quest ever came out over here anyway, so I was over the goddamn moon when Anthology finally hit. I fucking devoured those games, and allegedly, I have this very magazine to thank for that. Allegedly. All the way back in issue 81, the magazine launched a petition to get Final Fantasy Chronicles released over here in Europe. It was published alongside this bizarre interview with series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, and absolutely glowing reviews for the two included games, which, naturally, couldn't help but poke fun at the aging graphics. Pixel art was still very unfashionable at the time, but it's still hard for me to imagine anybody looking at Chrono Trigger and thinking it looks rough. I'm sorry you have shit taste, my guy. Ultimately, Final Fantasy Chronicles never did come out over here. Chrono Trigger wouldn't hit PAL territories at all until the Nintendo DS version in the late 2000s. Instead, Square brought over Final Fantasy VI as a standalone game, and Anthology as games 4 and 5. 4 received a somewhat less positive review in Anthology than it did in Chronicles, but they liked it all the same. It's kind of funny reading these now, knowing how maligned this port of 5 is these days. I guess tastes change. When Square finally confirmed that Anthology was getting a PAL release, the magazine naturally took credit, claiming their petition is what convinced the bigwigs that there was a market for these old games in the UK. And I'm not saying it didn't, I'm sure it had some impact. But the petition was for Chronicles, not Anthology, and Final Fantasy VI's standalone release came out in time to be reviewed just one issue after they launched their petition, seemingly without the magazine's intervention. I'm just saying, strong sales for 6 were probably a factor as well. That FF6 review was published alongside a retrospective on the entire series actually, that contained some dubious information, to say the least. Apparently Ultima and Wizardry don't exist. They'd correct this in time, to be fair, giving those games some credit once the Origins collection came along, but then that retrospective was full of actual factual errors, so what are you gonna do? These retro re-releases were just about the biggest thing happening on the PS1 in the 2000s, so each successive game became the centerpiece of the issue that reviewed it. They really milked these games for all they were worth. Before the reviews, there was the announcement, and then you got several issues of walkthroughs, all the while singing the franchise's praises. They started printing fan art, having Final Fantasy-themed readers sections, and even more features about the games, all of which would eventually give rise to a regular feature called Final Fantasy. The fanzine was basically, as many fanzines tend to be, a public forum, with readers writing not just to the magazine but to each other as well. It was full of fan art and polls and a Q&A section where readers could write in asking for help from other members of the community. It was cozy as fuck and felt a little more approachable than the Final Fantasy forums I'd found online at that point. Shout out the FF7 Citadel, that place was great, loved the fanfic, but it was also intimidating for a tween to try and engage with the community there. The immediacy of an online forum was scary, and my impression was, perhaps wrongly, that most of its users were American young adults with much more knowledge and experience in the franchise than I had. Most of the fantasy community seemed closer to my age and naturally had to deal with all the same bullshit that came with living in Europe and liking Japanese games back then. There were no letters in the final issue, sadly. They published their pick of the best fan art and listed some of their favourite stuff in the franchise, which... ugh. The rest of the section was a short guide to the series as it stood in the post-PS1 era, with a little advice on where to begin. Honestly, it never felt like the send-off that the fantasy deserved. Of all the mag's regular features, this was the one I know was going to miss the most, and I really wanted to know if anyone else felt the same way. But I suppose it fits the theme of the issue. Acknowledgement that it was time to say goodbye to the PS1 and move on to its sleeker younger brother. You know, I'm not sure what kind of horses these guys know that can be felled by something as paltry as a shotgun blast. No weapon forged by man has any hope of wounding such a beast. Nothing short of a dying star's final scream could even hope to singe their chitinous exoskeletons. We are powerless before them, allowed to exist only at their whim. It is for that reason that we must try our best to appease them, to keep them from growing bored and wiping us from this earth like shit from a boot. I implore you, follow the link in the description to the webpage you see here and consider donating. All of the proceeds will be used to procure sacrifices for the Council of Equines, that they might allow mankind to continue its meager existence in service to them. You'll also get access to my Discord server, where we sing praise to the horses for the mercy they have shown us thus far. You get the sense that even the mag's staff was surprised at how long it ran for. Looking at the Twilight years, you can really see just how little they had to work with. Literally the only news on the cover of issue 100 is the PSP, and every single review in that issue was for a budget reprint. The surrounding issues paint a similarly grim picture. Pretty much the only publisher still regularly putting out PS1 games was Phoenix, and infinite love to them, but most of these games just weren't that exciting. The drought of new games turned every issue into a themed issue. You had the summer issue, the Christmas issue, the sci-fi issue, all celebrations of the console's past. Even when there was a new game worth talking about, like Buttsubushi or Creatures 3, the bulk of the mag would be dedicated to reliving the glory days. It was basically a retro mag at this point, a guide to games gone by, looking to the past and not the future. You know, I actually still have my old copy of the fantasy issue. You might be wondering why this, of all issues, is the one that we kept. Was it the beautiful and thematically appropriate cover art? Was it the mass amounts of Final Fantasy bullshit? Was it because it introduced me to His Dark Material, the best books of my early teens? No. No to all of the above. My mother kept this issue because it features my very first piece of published writing.
Evil Ryan. You're on that OPM2 reviewer. That's right, but to no good. Two-timing scumbag. Go to hell. He's been working for that evil Richard Keith for a long time. And in OPSM2, I am at Nightdown. Burn him. I hate all traitors to OPM PS1. He even said in OPM2 that PS1 is too old hat. Pull him to a table and pull him apart.
I was not the funniest bitch in the world at 12 years old, I'll admit, but it was kind of nice to be able to engage with the mag and join in on the jokes like this, especially since the man answering the letters at the time was my personal hero, Dan Curley. As time went on, and serious journalism became a serious challenge, the core staff would start to take on exaggerated personas, presenting themselves more like a comical cast of characters than a dying magazine's final caretakers. The artists became the fairly sapient art trolls, youngster Sam Deanways became the boy, and token northerner Dan Curley was, well, a token northerner. I loved Curly. All of these mags were published down south, mostly in Bath, and the journos seemed to be from down there too, so it was just kinda nice to see someone from up my end representing us. Of course, given that the rest of the staff were a bunch of southern bastards, Curly was frequently the butt of the magazine's jokes. It's all in good fun, there doesn't seem to be any of the genuine classism you sometimes see with the north-south divide over here, but I've been haunted by this operation game they made out of his likeness for nearly 20 years, and somebody has to pay. As it happens, Curly was the lucky man who got to write OPM's last ever review, the surprisingly solid Ford Truck Mania, a budget racing game that had released months prior. I don't remember Curly's writing being this stuffed full of weird celebrity references though, and they're also mean. To women, specifically. It's ladsmag bullshit, I'm not a fan. They shift away from relatively straightforward journalism to wacky shenanigans started around issue 73. The magazine underwent a transformation to coincide with the release of the slimmed-down PS1, gesturing towards a sleeker, new millennium look with all the fancy future fonts and shit, but also emphasizing more primary colours and silly illustrations to match its new, much goofier tone. The new design brought with it 3 new characters, separate from the staff's usual personas. The judge, who oversaw the execution of terrible video games, eventually taking on the mag itself. The control freak, who reviewed new peripherals, I hate him. And Cheats Daddy, a cockney gangster handing out performance-enhancing codes to the mag's struggling readership. It's all got big 2010 YouTuber energy in a way. They even did that thing where they turned a bad video game into their fucking nemesis. I remember their unflinching hatred of the Hugo series absolutely fascinated me. How bad could it be? Well, a few months ago, I gave the Amiga game a shot, and I was kind of impressed, if you can believe it. It's obviously a game for toddlers, but look at him, he's just a little guy. I don't get why the mag had to be so mean. Oh well, Hugo got the last laugh anyway. Might be fun to try to review Ouija boards sometime, see what the magazine thinks of Hugo now. I find it interesting that they would re-rate games over time to reflect the evolving expectations of the industry, and the changing tastes of their changing staff though. And even though you do see a lot of the standard 5th generation bullshit, dismissal of pixel art and arcade game genres for example, their tastes were often a little out there even for the time. Like, take a look at their definitive all-time top 10 list. It's so good! I don't agree with it whatsoever, but I respect it, you know? I mean, all of these games are beloved for sure, and it has your requisite Metal Gear Solid, Tony Hawk, Tomb Raider, etc. But there are some genuine left-field picks here. Ape Escape is great, but that over Crash or Spyro? And like, how many people have even heard of Buttsubushi? All of my precious viewers have, of course, but it's such an obscure gem in the PS1's library, and I fucking love that it's included here, even though it probably wouldn't make the cut in my list. Nothing but respect for a list that includes Parappa the Rapper, even if that comment about the Japanese is a little cringeworthy. The nation that gave the world a fat worm blows a sparky has no grounds to accuse anyone else of being bonkers. Good game though. But that's not all. The mag features a second definitive all-time top 10 PS1 games list for some inscrutable reason, and neither of them features a single Final Fantasy. It's mostly the same list, but now Metal Gear Solid's number 1 spot has been stolen by Pro Evolution Soccer 2, while Buttsubushi and Ape Escape have been replaced by Tekken 2 and Circuit Breakers. And honestly, Circuit Breakers might be an even weirder pick than Buttsubushi is. Nearly every other publication at the time gave it pretty middling reviews, and I haven't heard anybody breathe its name in decades. Buttsubushi is at least considered like a hidden gem by the people who know of it. But Circuit Breakers is one of the top 10 PS1 games of all time is a genuinely against the grain opinion. Massive respect. The left field picks don't stop there though. You would have expected the last demo disc to be full of the PS1's greatest hits, the MGS demo, the Tekken 3 demo, maybe a Tomb Raider, right? Would you believe I'm glad we got Anna Kournikova instead? Honestly, this was the surprise hit of the disc for me. I fucking suck at it, but bitch, the vibes! And it plays so smoothly. Returning a serve just feels so good, and the relative speeds of the characters and the balls is perfectly tuned. I love how the characters are drawn too. Look at his grumpy little face, he looks like his god was just nailed to a stick. Shame we didn't get the original box art over here though, the Japanese art is so stylish. Can't believe this demo disc actually managed to sell me on a PS1 game 20 years later. Did I not play this demo at the time? Obviously, despite what the disclaimer says, Smash Court Tennis was not a game that was currently in development. By the end, the demo discs didn't really showcase new games anymore. They were full of old classics pertaining to the theme of the issue. What few new games the PS1 was getting generally didn't cost a whole lot more than the magazine did, so it must have seemed pointless to put the effort in to produce a demo for them. But, to the world's collective shock, there actually was a new demo on here. Archie McLean's 3D Pool was a super recent release, and one that I don't think anyone was expecting to get the demo treatment. Sadly, it's not one that ever held my interest though. Archie McLean's Pool was originally an Amiga and Atari ST game, and quite a beloved one too. But while I love a bit of pool or snooker with the lads, Q Sports games have just never really done it for me. The bulk of the disc's commercial games are actually, of all things, music games. We got Dancing Stage Fever, Buster Groove, Vib Ribbon, The Goat, my beloved Music 2000, and the only game on the whole disc to also appear in the mag's top 10 lists, Parappa the Rapper. I guess OPM wanted their funeral to be a party, a celebration, not a somber affair. whether they wanted us to celebrate all that they had accomplished in their final years, or were instead themselves celebrating the idea that they'd finally get to move on to shit that's culturally relevant. Who can say? If there's anything that this particular demo disc is famous for, though, it's the sheer volume of net Eurosi games for it. And as with the commercial games, there are some really interesting inclusions and omissions here. First, a little background, just in case anyone's not in the know. Net Eurosi was a stripped-down dev kit for the PS1 made to encourage the industry's next generation of code monkeys. They were sold in bulk to various educational institutions, but you could also buy them as a consumer, provided you had a decent PC and more money than God. Once you did, you were given access to the secret Net Yaruzi forum, where you could share advice, resources, and games with the community there. There were also some Usenet news groups, including an unofficial one which is still accessible and even somewhat active to this day. Anyway, Sony Computer Entertainment Europe would often seek out Eurosi games to feature on the demo disc, which was a big deal. This was realistically the only chance you had to let anybody outside the community play your games. There was no legal way to play Eurosi games on real hardware, and I can hardly imagine how exciting it must have been to have your games featured alongside heavy hitters like Pipe Mania or Miss Pac-Man's Maze Madness. What the fuck is this description, OPM? Despite Sony region locking the fucking communication channels, games from outside Europe sometimes made their way to the discs too, including, famously, Terra Incognita, a Japanese action-adventure made by Team Fatal, whose programmer, Mitsuru Kamiyama, would go on to work on several high-profile games at Square Enix in the 2000s. That's one of the disc's notable omissions as it happens, but at least its music shows up. At first I wondered if Samsara K. Sympto had literally ripped the music from Incognita, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Team Fatal does not credit a music composer, and A. Sympto does credit Sony, so was this just something that was accessible to all Net Yaruzi users? If so, I'm shocked that I've never heard it show up anywhere else. Asymptote is a good time, but fuck is it cruel? One hit and that's it, game over. No lives and no continued. It demands perfection, and I am a flawed and lazy bitch. I will leave mastery up to someone else. The games list here is full of bangers, but I distinctly remember being disappointed that there was no Psychon or Clone on the disc. Those were two of my favourites, and they felt so rare compared to something like Adventure Game, which seemed like it showed up in every other issue. Like, why? They slagged it off in the mag. Put something you like on there then, you dumb bitch. Not that I would ever slag it off. Adventure Game is an unassailable classic. Much like the magazine, not all of its humour has aged well, and that joke that games make where they point out the banality of their own quest design is tedious. But it still gets a few chuckles out of me here and there. The iconic guard dialogue outside the town has some real Blackadder energy to it. You know, it's like Monty Python, but good. And I find the skunky graphics and sound super charming too. There's something that's just so cozy about these faceless blobs of flesh arranged in a pale imitation of the human form. Fuck this camera now. It feels like the second you step into the misty mountains, it just gets sick of looking at you, and the slope physics make it fucking impossible to get anywhere. And the birds, I hate them so much. Very clever of the designer to make the game's enemy drain the player's life energy as well as their characters. Blitterboy felt like it appeared in just about every issue too, but I've got no complaints there. Blitterboy fucking rules. It's definitely one of the more commercial feeling games to come out of the Yaruzi scene. It's just full of top-notch sprite work and sound design, and some really polished gameplay to boot. It's super simple. All you need to do is rescue all the babies, and then kill everyone. But it gets surprisingly challenging, and it's super satisfying. All the menu animations and effects give off such strong Amiga energy as well, it is supremely my shit. Oh, not the birds again! The Amiga/ST Euroscene energy begins to make sense once you read the interviews that Super Internet Friends conducted with some of the more prominent members of the Euro Yaruzi scene. It turns out a lot of them grew up during the home computer revolution and got their start programming for all of the old microcomputers. My beloved Psychon, for example, began life as an Amiga shareware game called Psycule, which, fuck, I think I like this more than the PS1 game. I mean, it plays worse, and it's a lot harder, but it's also way more violent, which is the important thing, I feel. But to stick with games that are actually on this final demo disc, one of the more interesting discoveries that I made going down this little rabbit hole was the origin of Bouncer. I remember wondering where Bouncer 1 was as a kid, and thinking it must just have been included on a way earlier disc that I didn't have access to. How right I was. The original Bouncer was included on a Serenade public domain pack disc for the Atari ST. God damn, this aesthetic competes with the vibes of the PS1 demos and then some. Bouncer itself keeps the good times going with an absolutely incredible soundtrack that is well worth trading the sound effects for. And it's a much worse game than either its sequel or the PS2 reboot by Squaresoft, but I think I might like it more on the basis of the music alone. So good. Now, Bouncer 2 was another fairly common Yaruzi game as I remember it, but a good few of the games on this disc appear to have had their first appearances here. Some Sari Symptote, for example, but also Roller, Git, Arena, and Down. I'm not surprised that people kept making net Yaruzi games, but I am lightly surprised that anyone was still seeking out stuff for the demos this late on. I suppose that was a true value of the demo discs at this point now. You probably already owned most of the commercial games that they could put on there, or at least had them on other demo discs already, but the net Yaruzi community offered something genuinely new. Roller and Git were the goats of the new breed for me. Roller is a kind of simplified monkey ball-like with some really satisfying physics and sound design, while Git just hits all the right buttons for me. It's an abstract puzzle game that requires both pattern and colour matching skills, all wrapped up in this surreal Eurocomputer aesthetic. But being real, if I'm playing a puzzle game on here, it's going to be Super Bub Contest. Git's great, but Super Bug Contest not only looks like Puzzle Bobble or Puyo Puyo, it's also at their level of quality. It fucking rules. Great music, great graphics, great gameplay. Thank you for not taking my money. God, I could talk about the net Yaruzi games forever, and there are just so many bangers here. Time Slip, Gravitation, Decaying Orbit, all winners, one and all. And there are so many more interesting stories to tell about them too. But this video is getting long enough as it is, so it's probably time to move on. But if you're good, and you smash that like button, maybe I'll make a dedicated video in the cultural context of the Euro Yaruzi scene in the future. You know, I alluded to it earlier, but I remember wondering why that disclaimer still showed up at the start of demo discs even long after it stopped being true. Were they just not able to remove it? I remember it giving me kind of a weird feeling, something I couldn't quite identify at the time. The promotional screens at the end of the demos got me wistful too. Coming soon, 1999 was a surreal thing to see on a new disc you bought in 2004, you know? I remember seeing them at the end of demos when they were still new and I was even younger, and having them light my imagination on fire. What wonders would the full game hold? I'd spent ages imagining, making up a game in my head based on what I'd played. The demo discs were the #1 hype builder for me back then, but by the end they were, like the magazine, a window to the past instead of the future. They were comforting, rather than exciting. The PS1 was old now, and I'd already owned a PS2 for 2 years, but I still found the older mag weirdly compelling, and given the choice, I would always buy it over the PS2 one. I guess what I was experiencing, at the ripe old age of 12, was something akin to nostalgia. Which sounds ridiculous, right? I wasn't even a teenager yet. I wouldn't be for months. But a lot changed as I entered my second decade. The turn of the millennium had just happened, Sega had stopped making consoles, and I'd just started secondary school and had to choose which group of friends I'd follow. We were all enrolled at different places, and the internet just wasn't quite ubiquitous enough yet for us to easily keep in touch, and I missed them. And then there were the politics of the early 2000s. I don't think I even knew who the Prime Minister was in the 90s, why would I have? But seeing the streets filled with bodies begging the government not to go to war, only to be ignored for a conflict that everyone seemed to agree was pointless, made me far too cynical, far too young. And I know I wasn't alone in that. The world was scary, I missed my friends, and I'd foolishly backed the Dreamcast. Even though I had a PS2 by 2004, the PS1 magazine was just this silly little thing, inexplicable in its longevity and unconcerned with current events. It connected me with a simpler time, and that's probably part of why I kept buying it even after it had outlived its usefulness. Of course, I was a child, and my best years were ahead of me, not behind. I forgot all about the mag and even stopped gaming altogether at the end of my teens. I was too busy with bands, with new friends, and experimenting with all the things I wasn't allowed to do when I was younger. But I knew that the past would be there for me if I needed it, and while it's never healthy to live in your nostalgia, it can be nice to visit every once in a while. I got these scans from oldgamemags.com, which, yes, you have to pay to access, but most of this stuff wouldn't exist online at all without their hard work, so I think it's worth it. I've said it before, but the hard work of archivists like this is what makes retro content like mine possible in the first place, and we really need to stop treating it as a given that everything ends up online eventually, especially in a time of escalating aggression against wonderful organizations like archive.org. Just like with websites and newspapers, magazine archives allow us to view history in context, to see how tastes and trends have shifted over time. It's easy to make fun of the takes that these magazines have, but those were their genuine opinions at the time, and it's only as the memory of the PS1 has been shaped by the nostalgia of people my age that those tastes have really changed. So long as you head in knowing that the standards of good taste have changed in more ways than one, I think you'll find plenty of value digging into this stuff, even if you never grew up with it. Plus, if you like crusty old boomer games, it's a pretty good way to find some hidden gems. Round of Buttsubushi, anyone?
If you watch even 1 second of
Ethereal Worlds
and don't contribute, you're a thief. A common thief.